welcome everybody. My name's Maggie Detloff. I'm the Assistant Curator of Photography and New Media at the Cantor. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this Museum Nights event, a conversation with Carlos Motta, Art, Documentary, and Activism. This event is presented in conjunction with the Cantor's current special exhibition, When Home Won't Let You Stay, Migration Through Contemporary Art. So before I turn it over to the artist and our student respondent, I'm going to give you some tips for participating in tonight's event, briefly introduce the exhibition, and then introduce our artist, speaker, and student respondent for the evening. So I want to point out that live captioning is available for tonight's event. You can click on the CC icon at the bottom, and if you select Show Subtitle, it displays 3 lines of text in real time overlaid along the bottom, or you can move the text box around so that it's convenient for you. Or you can click View Full Transcript, which lets you scroll back up in case you missed something that was said. The format of tonight's event is an artist talk followed by questions from our student respondent. I'll also possibly jump in with some questions, as well as the Cantor's Interim Director for Academic and Public Programs, Kate Holohan. We'll have dedicated time for audience Q&A at around the halfway point of the event. And at that time, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or unmute yourself to ask directly. So the exhibition, When Home Won't Let You Stay, is organized by Ruth Erickson, Mannion Family Curator, and Ava Respini, Barbara Lee Chief Curator, with Annie Pulagura, Curatorial Assistant at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston. The Cantor Art Center presentation is organized by Maggie Detloff, that's me, and Jessica Ventura, Curatorial Assistant, and we gratefully acknowledge support from the Halperin Exhibition Fund. The exhibition considers how contemporary artists are responding to the unprecedented amounts of migration, immigration, and displacement of people all over the world today. The show features more than 24 artworks by 18 artists who are from, live in, or work in over a dozen different countries. And the show highlights their diverse responses to migration, ranging from personal accounts to poetic meditations. Migration is not a new phenomenon, as we all know, but this exhibition also calls attention to how it has changed and accelerated through various historical, political, and social developments. The show is organized around several overlapping themes, exploring ideas of home, sites and modes of transit, provisional structures like borders and refugee camps, and narratives of displacement and belonging. Personal, intergenerational, and cultural memory and storytelling play a large role in these themes. Each artwork speaks to a specific story of migration, and I found that it's very important to consider who is telling these stories and how they're telling them. Carlos Motta's work in the show, The Crossing, is in my mind one of the most important works in the show for considering this issue. His interview-based artworks speak directly to questions of how art and film can play a politically active role. So I'm extremely grateful to Carlos for joining us tonight, and I'm now going to introduce him without any further delay. Born in 1978 in Colombia, Carlos's multidisciplinary art practice documents the social conditions and political struggles of sexual, gender, and ethnic minority communities in order to challenge normative discourses through visibility and self-representation. His work was the subject of the survey exhibitions Carlos Motta, Formas de Libertad at the Museo de Arte Moderna de Medellin in Colombia, and that traveled to Matucana 100 in Santiago, Chile, and Carlos Motta for Democracy, There Must Be Love at the Rådhusen Konsthall in Gothenburg, Sweden. His solo exhibitions at international museums include Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Pres Art Museum, Miami, Museum de Arte Latinoamérica de Buenos Aires, Sala de Arte Pública Siqueiros, New Museum, New York, MoMA PS1, Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia. He also participated in the 11th Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art, the 32nd Biennale de Sao Paulo, Gothenburg International Biennial of Contemporary Art, the 10th Guangzhou Biennial, and the 10th Lyon Biennial. Carlos Motta's first 20-year career monograph, Carlos Motta, History's Back Rooms, was published by Skira in 2020. That is so exciting. And Motta won the Wilczek Foundation's Prize for Creative Promise, the Future Generation Art Prize, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He was appointed tenure-track Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Practice at Pratt Institute's Fine Arts Department in 2019. So we are so lucky to have him with us today. After Carlos's presentation, Stanford student Rima Makarian will respond with questions to open up our Q&A session. Rima is class of 2024, tentatively majoring in architectural design. She's participating in Stanford's Italic program, which is, if you don't know, Immersion in the Arts, Living in Culture, a year-long residential learning program. And she's been working on a multidisciplinary project called Forgotten Faces of Artsakh that tells the stories and documents the post-war lives of Armenian refugees from Artsakh. Thank you both for joining us tonight. And now I will turn it over to Carlos.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and for the introduction, and Aubrey and Kate as well for the invitation and for organizing the event. And thank you, Rima, for accepting the invitation to respond with questions to the presentation a bit later. The invitation was a specific one. As Maggie was talking about my practice, I have a wide range of, wait, Aubrey, is there a way that I can not see myself as I speak? Let's see. Okay.
Yes, there is.
No,
okay.
I got it, thank you.
Okay.
It's just like suddenly it was a mirror and it was a bit awkward. So I was saying that my work expands in a variety of mediums and topics. But I think Maggie's invitation and Kate's invitations and Aubrey's invitation was a precise one and concise one. So I'm going to focus only on 3 projects where I have used the form of the interview, which is a form that I have used already for about 20 years, and which I have learned to understand, perfect, and engage in different ways. So I want to present 3 projects shortly so that we have time to have a conversation later, where I'm going to discuss what it means to create a documentary-based practice, working in collaboration with communities and different subjects, and also engaging in the art of an interview, which we oftentimes take for granted, as it is something that is so kind of widely used and we encounter day to day in the media and the news, etc. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So back in 2005, when I graduated from grad school, I had the opportunity to do a 1-year program at the Whitney Museum in New York called the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program. And as I was participating in this as a visual artist, I had a studio. I had a series of studio visits with artists that I greatly admired. One of them being Isaac Julian, who I believe is also one of the participants in the exhibition and whose work you may have encountered. And another one being Andrea Fraser, another one being Greg Bordowitz, and a number of practicing artists and academics whose work I really greatly admired. And in conversation with all of these people, as I was trying to forge a language for my work, I started to understand that I was interested in traveling, and I was interested in engaging the legacies and histories of American intervention in the Latin American context. I was born in Colombia. I grew up in Colombia until I was 19 years old, when I had the opportunity to leave and go to school in the United States. It was a bit of a turmoil socially and politically when I was growing up in the 1980s and the 90s in Colombia. There was greatly a civil war. There was also a war against narco trafficking, and there were many actors that were confronting each other, making life a bit of a challenge. From just safety in terms of going out to the street to larger political issues such as a great influx of kidnapping, great explosions due to narco trafficking. And when I had the chance to finally leave, the distance living in the United States allowed me to reflect upon the political conditions that I had been sort of like living in, but not necessarily reflecting upon, because we were, you know, it was just part of our daily life. So I was interested in understanding the conditions that had led to the kind of violence that we were experiencing back then. And I started to understand that the role that the United States had played in the region was a really serious one and a grave one. And I wanted to make a work that would allow me to create my own understanding and my own history of the relationship between the United States and the Latin American context. So I managed to get a grant, and I embarked on what became a 3-year project called The Good Life, or La Buena Vida, which took me from Mexico to Argentina, stopping in 12 capital cities, where I had the chance to interview close to 400 people on the streets of these cities. I was thinking about documentary film. I was thinking about documentary representation. I was thinking about the role of the media in creating what is understood as the idea of public opinion. And I was thinking about how public opinion shapes the ways in which we understand political and social affairs. But I was also willing to, or wanting to understand the ways in which these topics that I just mentioned shaped our subjectivity as citizens. So the idea started with going to these cities, establishing a relationship with a local filmmaker and a local guide, somebody who would know the city well, and to travel with them, making interviews exclusively on the streets of these cities. I conceived of 5 questions that I asked over and over throughout the whole length of the project. And the idea with the questions, and I'm going to switch to another screen 1 second. So the idea with these questions was to be able to create a kind of database, online database of these responses. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, close to 400 subjects. And this is back in 2005, when the internet was still a kind of platform in development, and there was great potential to experiment with it. So the idea was to use this new technology of the internet as a way to create a self-sustaining platform that would be administered by myself, that would concentrate on the information I had gathered through the interviews. The topics of the interviews range from, had all in what I wanted to talk about. Sorry, I'm just trying to find them in English here. Questions. Was understand the ways in which perhaps there was a social consciousness around the relationship of the United States with within the Latin American context, in terms of histories of intervention, histories of political meddling, histories of economic intervention, etc. So the questions are: do you have any knowledge or opinion about US foreign policy in regard to Latin America? Do you remember any instances of US intervention in Latin America? What do you think are the effects of these interventions in the local population? What is your opinion about the current form of government, democracy? How would you like to be governed? And what are your expectations from a leader? And the responses vary greatly. I tried to, with the help of the local filmmaker and the assistant, to kind of map the city out and then just really just walk and talk to people on the street. I was also interested in considering the role of the camera and the microphone and the interaction with the person. So this wasn't an interview where we were seeking necessarily to get to know people. It was also, the project is also about highlighting the mechanisms of mediation that are inherent in the process of putting a camera up, asking a question to somebody and expecting a form of answer. However, because I am not the news media and I was in fact starting this project in response critically to the news media, it became a very interesting project of getting to know people in a kind of social and political sense in very intimate ways. And what I thought would be responses that were going to be opinionated about politics and so on, quickly turned into very moving personal responses about the ways in which politics have shaped people's lives. We started sharing, so I am actually, my voice is featured in the interviews a lot. We started conversing and we started kind of like thinking about you know, what this project would become. So I was being very open and frank with people. Back in 2005, when I started, I didn't really know what the project would be. The project took this shape that you're seeing now much later, probably around 2008. So I can just show you, demonstrate very quickly the ways in which you can navigate it. These things right now seem like really old technologies. Back in 2005, to create a database that was active, so active like this, was a bit more involved and interesting. So if you saw, I just marked one question. So whoever is still appearing on the screen responded to that question. You could also see it by gender with English subtitles, by city, age, and occupations. If you are interested in knowing more about this project, please go on the URL and you can have an experience of the interviews yourself. There was also an installation version of this work. I was thinking about the Athenian Agora, which was the architectural form where, you know, the myth of the beginning of democracy was constructed in the Greek context. So I replicated the form of the Agora and split it in 4 so that I would have a kind of formal platform to install the videos on them. So the idea is that if you brought all of these parts together, you would have a mini plywood version of an Athenian Agora. And the monitors were located there as standings for the citizens. So when you enter the installation, all the videos are amplified, even though there are also headphones available. And you have a kind of rumor of the 12 voices that are speaking at the same time, mimicking a bit the experience of being out in public space. So there are a couple of things that were interesting to me about this project. The first one had to do with refining that methodology of the interview, what it meant to gather material, to engage with people, to create the potentially a kind of subjective form of statistics in terms of responses. How to navigate this great amount of hours of interview, how to structure it in sort of like what I just described on the website, and also how to edit it for the presentation, and the kinds of narratives and narrations that became apparent in the process are the result of the work. The work doesn't have the ambition to be a representational project in terms of opinions or perspectives. It's really much more about the relationship between the social and the political and individual subjectivities, and the ways in which those things are greatly interconnected. But the other thing that was interesting to me about this project is that I understood that working as an artist and as an independent artist gave me the possibility to construct the spaces, to control and construct the spaces where I wanted to present my own work. And that felt very liberating. again, using the internet in that sense, not only made the work accessible to me in terms of shaping it and controlling it, but also it promised at the time an idea of being a much more democratic space. So I of course did not stay in touch with the 400 people that I interviewed on the streets, but I did stay in touch with some of them. And it was also a way to share with them the work that they had collaborated with me to produce. So this idea of being autonomous and being able to control one's own narrative is something that I continue to use, even though it's been about 17 years since I made this work. So I'm gonna jump ahead to 2015, where I wanted to work again on the construction of a video archive. This is a work called Gender Talents, whose primary form is also an internet archive, similar to the one that you just saw, but 15 years later, so it's a little bit more easier to navigate, and it's not reliant on Flash. I'm sorry, my light just went up. And the idea with this work was to create an archive of video portraits of activists in 4 different countries: in Guatemala, in Colombia, in the United States, and in India. The idea behind the work was recognizing, when I started this work, it was about 2011, recognizing that there were many activists of organizations of trans and intersex activists in different parts of the world that were being neglected by their governments in terms of funding, but also in terms of exposure or being able to expose the work that they were doing to the local and international context for fundraising, but also for awareness. So I established a series of collaborations with about 12 different organizations, from grassroots groups that had just been formed, like the Multicultural Network of Transgender Women of Guatemala, to much more established organizations like Santa Maria Fundación in Colombia. And I approached each one of those groups. I had a meeting with the directors, with the members of the organization, and I presented the idea. I said, I have the opportunity to work on this project. I have some funding, and I am seeing that there is a lack of visibility for the groundbreaking work that you are doing within your activist organizations. I'm not here to propose making an artwork that is going to be shown in an exhibition context necessarily. I'm here to propose a collaboration that can be as useful to you as an organization as it can be to me as somebody who's growing as an artist and interested in tackling questions of representation through media. So the conversations were very, very interesting, challenging, but ultimately resulted in this intimately collaborative project with the organizations that, actually I'm gonna go back, that led to the form of the project. So the ways in which the shoots and the structure of the projects were configured were in relationship to the ways in which each one of these groups wanted to present themselves and thinking about what they wanted to do with the videos themselves. So some of the organizations wanted to use the videos as a fundraising strategy. They wanted to tell the stories and tell the work that they had been doing at a local level so that they could reach organizations such as the Red Cross, locally and internationally, for example. So that it became a process of thinking about how a group would work collectively with the assistance of an artist, myself, but also the people who came with me, which was a crew, to tell those stories. And the ways in which it happened was very interesting because basically there was a person who was chosen by each one of the organizations to be the leader, the conceptual leader, so to speak, of the process. And they decided who would ask the questions, what kind of questions would be asked. we were sure that we didn't want to have a hierarchical relationship in terms of a director, namely, the role that an artist often plays. But there was also a question of gender identity here. It was a cisgender person in relationship to trans and intersex folk and the ways in which they wanted to present themselves. So those conversations were also interesting and challenging, what it meant for me to come to a group like this and attempt to represent those concerns. And the answer was simple. It was like, you can't represent it because you don't have that life experience. You don't have, you are not living the politics in the ways in which we are living them. However, they saw in me an ally, so to speak, and a person that could assist in creating a structure that might potentially be useful to them. So if you want to see this work, you can go on that website. The portraits are all there. There are very different stories. There are very personal stories. There are very political stories. There are stories that speak about public health. There's stories that speak about personal histories. There's stories that speak about sex work. There are stories about HIV/AIDS. There are stories about love and affection. And this is one of the things that was very nice about the project, is oftentimes when folks are making work on these topics, they tend to focus on the stories of trauma and the stories of disruption, right? Because those things might actually call people's attention. And it's a strategy oftentimes that even comes from organizations themselves, where they want to call attention through a disruptive event to fundraise, for example. But we also thought that we wanted to give a more nuanced representation of the wholeness of the work of the organizations. So there are many videos that were directed by the activists themselves, where they are, for example, in the third video from left to right on the top row, it's a video where there is a group of 17 sex workers in Guatemala City that are discussing their ideas about friendship and love in the context of sex work. And it was an idea that we all discussed together, but it's a really special moment, because it is oftentimes when trans sex workers are being interviewed, the last thing that they're spoken about is whether they think of themselves as people who can fall in love with the people they work with, or the kinds of friendships they establish with their clients or amongst themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So the result of that work is this portal. But then there was the opportunity to present and launch the work in the context of a biennial in Guatemala City called the País Biennial back in 2014. And so the curator of the event invited me to present the work. And we had already talked about this with these groups, right? And the fact that it was not really a video that the best venue for this video was not a museum space. Not only because the museum is a space that it's not often accessible to most people, but also because they wanted the videos to have a different kind of impact. So we managed to have a few meetings with Galilea with the red streaks here in the hair, who's the leader of the organization in Guatemala. We met and I was like, okay, so what can we do? We have this opportunity to present the work that you've been doing in the context of an art exhibition. How do we make this happen so that it's useful to you? So with all of these people who are in the photograph and others, we had these brainstorming sessions to think about what to do, right? So we said we have venues, we have a cultural center, we have a museum venue. And what we ended up coming up with was presenting the works in a large scale event. They had been wanting to do an event. They wanted to be covered by the media, but because of transphobia and discrimination, the media did not really pay attention to the work they had been doing. So we started to think about the possibility of work in the context of art, in the context of cultural exhibitions, as a kind of intervention into the media space. And they came up with this agenda that you see here, that presented the organization, presented guests from different NGOs, presented the videos that we made together, presented the work that they had done with a photographer, Jorge Chavarria. There were panel discussions, there was a coffee break, there was a social break, etc. And it became just basically an all-day event. The reason it was important is because trans sex workers in Guatemala, as I said earlier, are greatly stigmatized. And they did not find themselves to be welcome in the Spanish Cultural Center, which ended up being the venue for the event. They had never entered this space. So the idea that 200 of these activists who also came from different regions of the city got together and used this specific venue to present their work and to be in the space physically was really revolutionary, so to speak, and in their own terms. And we managed to get great attention from the art media because it was the art vibe. So there were articles in the cultural pages, there were articles in that reviewed the project, so to speak. And the question here is not whether the work was art, whether those questions were not important. The question here was that we managed to, through the institution, give a degree of visibility to the work that the organization was doing, to call these groups to come together and fundraise. And after the event, they raised a bunch of money that assisted for a few months of work. So it was generally an interesting experience of negotiations, both in terms of what it meant to create this project of representation, but also to insert it in a world that was not the world that they had, that they live in, that they exist in as political subjects. My mediation there is that I do exist in that world, and I'm well versed in conversing and negotiating with institutions. So there was this idea of making that gesture into a kind of useful art project that used the institution of art to call attention to something entirely different. These are just some of the photos of the event. So the third person from the left, what is the government, let's see what is the title in English, the government representative for issues of diversity in the government. And that was the first time that they all got together and got to speak about the work. Then there is the project that is currently on view at the museum in Stanford, which is a project called The Crossing. It's a couple of years later in 2017. And this project came about as an invitation of the Stedelijk Museum, which is one of the museums of modern and contemporary art in Amsterdam, for me to come and develop a work. So I did a few trips to Amsterdam. I met with the people from the museum, and I had already been paying attention for several years on the fate of LGBTQI+ migrants who were seeking asylum in the Netherlands, and the kinds of issues that the Dutch government and society were facing with the influx of migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, and how sometimes there was a kind of representation of how the liberal ethos of the Dutch people in accepting sexual diversity, but that led to accepting migrants that identified in these terms, but also the ways in which this started to create a kind of social clash, because many of these migrants, even though they were LGBTQI+, were also Muslim and were also practicing their religion, and were also ethnic migrants coming to the Netherlands. So there were all of these clashes where the Netherlands, and at some point it was widely reported how the Netherlands was kind of priding itself on supporting LGBT rights, but on the other hand, treating the other migrants who were coming from this region in very racist and xenophobic ways. So I was very interested in this topic, and I felt that it would be an interesting opportunity to make a work that asked those questions. So the way the process went is I reached out with the help of the Stedelijk Museum curator, Martijn, to an organization called Secret Garden. And Secret Garden is an organization that was founded to assist LGBTQI plus migrants to come to the Netherlands, not necessarily assist them in the process of coming to the Netherlands because they couldn't do that legally, but once they were in the Netherlands, to assist them with preparing their applications, with giving them support, both economic, social, psychological, to assist them in the process of learning the language, to prepare for the tests they would need to take in terms of seeking asylum. And I'm not speaking of a bigger organization. This is an organization that is run by 3 people and a few volunteers. So we had these meetings with them, and not unlike the meetings that I had with the collectives of trans and intersex activists earlier, the question was, you know, what kind of project would be useful for the organization, for the subjects that were going to be that were volunteering to be part of the work, knowing that it would be presented in this really central cultural institution in Amsterdam, that it would have great visibility as an artwork. So we had, I think there were 5 large gatherings with some of the people who were considering participating, where everybody kind of expressed their opinions about why they would want to do this, why they would not want to do this, what produced anxiety about the process of making their stories visible, what potentially made some people feel empowered, what the material would be, what the process would be of, in making it happen, and so on. And eventually, with the leaders of the organization, we decided that 11 people had come forward to who wanted to tell the story, and that we wanted this project to be a very intimate kind of look onto the experience of migration. So some people are telling the story of the actual crossing by boats, oftentimes by swimming, the kinds of really kind of dire experiences of going from one place to the other. Then also the experiences of living in the camps, the migrant camps in the Netherlands, and the clashes both with the Dutch authorities, but also with other migrants from the same regions who rejected them because of their sexual and gender identities. And then furthermore, the ways in which those people who had already been granted asylum and were free to go, so to speak, in the Dutch context, were adapting to their lives there. So that was one part of the project. There are 11 participants. This is Butterfly, who is telling a story about how her boat, the boat that she was crossing from Turkey to Greece, started to sink. And they felt that they were close to drowning, basically, when she remembers having this beauty mirror in her purse. And she used it to call the attention of the Greek Coast Guard, who eventually, within 30 or 40 minutes, came and saved them. So this is one of the testimonies. And then there was another part of the project that is equally important, because I was interested not only in telling the stories of the present, but understanding what had been the historical conditions of the Netherlands as a colonizing empire, in the treatment of other peoples and peoples who oftentimes came to seeking asylum or seeking refuge from the colonies and other places in the Netherlands. So I collaborated with an art historian and one of the curators at the Rijksmuseum, as well as the Amsterdam Museum and another museum called the Colonial Museum, to look at the archives of objects and look at the ways in which these institutions had been, through collecting artifacts and objects and photographs, created a memory of the colonial relationships between the Dutch and the nations they colonized. So we drew about 27 objects from those collections and presented them in these glass vitrines directly in front of the videos. So there is a conversation that is present and actual and very urgent from the perspective of the subjects in the videos, and then one that is speaking about the role of institutional memory in creating the conditions of knowledge for Dutch people who access these archives and museums to understand the place that we are in now. So there were these comprehensive guides that spoke about what each one of the objects was, where they came from, how they were, how they entered these collections, the role they played. Unfortunately, at the presentation of this traveling exhibition that is now at the Cantor, these objects did not make the show. And I think I often regret the fact that that could not happen. It was, of course, impossible because we would have needed to, you know, travel these objects from the Rijksmuseum to, I don't know, 5 cities or how many venues there have been in this show. So it became not feasible. And in conversations with the curators from the original iteration of the show in Boston, I suggested that perhaps we could do a kind of local iteration and conversation with encyclopedic museums in the venues that they were going, but they decided it was not a good idea. So I feel like the work that you have seen in the show is only half of the work. It's poignant, I think, and it communicates, and the testimonies are urgent, and I feel very good that I was able to share this work. But there is this whole other historical context to the work that was not presented. So in my mind, there's kind of sort of like 50% of the work has been seen in the United States. How are we doing with time? I could stop here, or I could present one more work.
I think it would be a great time to open it up for questions, if that's
Wonderful.
okay with you, Carlos, to make sure we've got plenty of time.
Yes.
So thank you so much. That was so compelling and interesting. And I'll just turn it over to Rima to get us started with some questions.
Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful presentation, Carlos. So unfortunately, as a freshman, I haven't seen the show myself, but I've looked a lot into his work, and I'm really excited to ask you some questions. As someone who has tried to make documentary work in the past, one of the biggest questions that I have for you and for myself is, how do we tell these stories of people who are marginalized or face dire circumstances without purely generating pity? And I think you touched on this a little bit. So how do we empower communities while telling their stories, while also telling the full reality of the trauma, but not putting them down and not just creating a story of pity?
That is a really important question. I think a question that anyone working in a documentary mode needs to ask themselves before they start a project. For me, it has been definitely a learning curve in terms of knowing that I think the position of artists and filmmakers sometimes is that they place themselves ahead of their subjects, and they consider themselves to be those who will have the power to represent. And I think that's perhaps the wrong approach. Oftentimes I feel that when you come to a place, you need to first understand the place that you're at. You need to understand the people you are working with. And in the case of the works that I presented and others that I didn't have a chance to present, it has been about conversation and really what is at stake for everyone involved in the making of a work like this. Everybody comes to the table with a different set of knowledge, right? Some people come with lived experience. Some people come with technical experience. Some people come with theoretical or political experience and whatnot. So when you bring all of these people together to speak about the ways in which you can forge an alliance, I think that is a good place to start. people then will decide whether or not they want to share intimate things. They want to share stories of trauma, and if they feel comfortable doing so. In the case of this, the crossing, you know, the core of these stories are horror stories of mistreatment and in the actual movement from one place to another. So I think for many of the people in the project, even though it was very hard, they wanted to make sure that that piece was also told. But it was not to be done in a way in which would only highlight the vulnerabilities of people, but it would also highlight their strengths and their subjectivity, and, you know, the ways in which they care for one another, the ways in which they have each other's backs. So I feel that, I mean, that's maybe a long-winded way to answer your question, but it's about communication and conversation with those people you are working with.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And then my next question is kind of, and I think you answered a part of this, but as someone who especially hasn't shared those experiences with the people that you are interviewing and the people whose stories you are telling, what is the right way to tell someone's experience that you don't share without kind of almost turning them into an object? And I think it's such a vulnerable place to be in front of a camera and to kind of, and this is, you know, we discuss a lot of this in my italic program about like, I think just the act of having your photograph taken is a part of your identity that's being kind of not taken away from you, but you don't own this image of you in a way. So that power is taken away from you. So I guess my question is, how do you capture someone that is in such a vulnerable setting, especially if you yourself, you know, don't share that exact identity and that exact story?
Yeah, I mean, you may have, of course, already noticed how the language of photographing and filming often mimics language of war and apprehension, like capture, shoot, you know, things like that. And that's one of the things that I was often suspicious about, is like, you know, how do you turn language? How do you present work in a way, and the attitudes around making work so that that is not centered on those terms necessarily. So, I mean, there is no right way. I think there is your way. You know, there is your own path to becoming someone who creates an ethical practice of representation through communication, through clarity in terms of how you express some of your ideas and intentions to those people to the people you want to work with. So I feel it's really a process of being mindful and writing your own story, so to speak.
Wonderful. I think we have a question from the audience, and I want to make sure that at least we get a couple of them in there, and then I can ask more if there's not enough time.
That sounds great. Sri, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, you got my name right, Maggie. Thank you so much for checking in. I appreciate it. Carlos, I really loved the La Buena Vida project, and just this idea of using something that seems so impersonal and objectified as a database, and then making it come alive and making it into this online collective. I really appreciated that. I was curious, I was going through the site and I noticed that the youngest participants were in that 15 to 19 age group. And I wondered, both for this project as well as gender talents, you know, did you consider interviewing children? And I know there may be, at least in the US, there are consent issues, not necessarily so much in other nation states. But I'm just wondering if you did have a chance to interact with youth younger than 15 and get their perspectives about how they felt about civil unrest and about gender, and because children are constantly under the authority of adults, and so there are multiple layers of authoritarianism that they need to grapple with, and they use inventive ways to resist. So I wondered if you got some perspectives.
That's a great point. Not really. I mean, it also, that also in the Good Life, it was largely about the fact that there was this question of knowing history, right? And oftentimes, I mean, some children are really smart and they know their history, but it's a history, like some people, some adults really already had a hard time recognizing the concept of US intervention as such, or had never really thought of that in those terms. So it really didn't occur to me. As you saw, I interviewed teenagers, and teenagers give their opinions, but I think teenagers already have a clear sense of themselves as political subjects and citizens. So I felt that was a good place to start. Maybe I should have tried with children. I really didn't, because I felt that it was not the theme. And also it was, of course, contingent on consent. Like I would not have approached children on the street without their parents to film them, because it would have been weird. Yeah, so maybe another project. I will definitely think of that. Thank you for that.
I see we have a question in the chat. Fujita Chisai asks, says, thank you for your wonderful talk. Could you tell me, do we have to connect? Do we need to know others? Please tell me your idea. What an interesting question.
Do we have to, I mean, the good thing about life is we don't have to do anything with no one. For me, it's been interesting to do so. For me, it's been interesting also to sometimes use the access and privilege that I have had as an artist and a person in the world to sort of like, you know, create platforms that may assist the struggles of others. So that has been something that I saw clearly for me as a path. So, and that really meant a lot, because it meant, you know, being able to create clear communication, find ways to connect with other people, develop different forms of ideas around empathy and solidarity and responsibility. And you fail all the time. There are projects in which you fail to think about something. There are projects where you think you are working in the right way and you do the right research and it fails. And then it's told to you by somebody that it has been offensive or that it wasn't mindful enough. And then you have to deal with that. You have to deal with the repercussions of somebody not being, feeling misrepresented or feeling like there was something that did not work. The good thing is that we can learn from those mistakes, so to speak, especially if they are unintentional or unconscious. Although, as we have learned in, you know, the really interesting years that we have lived recently, nothing is unintentional and unconscious. There's just, you haven't checked in with aspects of yourself that you need to check in with. So if you fail to see something, it's because there is maybe something that you haven't worked on yourself, right? And that happens. It happens often. It has happened recently. So you need to kind of figure out a way to make amends, so to speak, and move forward, thinking about the ways in which you can connect differently with others. Yeah.
Thank you. That was such a compelling answer, Carlos. I really appreciate that. And we have another question in the chat. Francisco asks, Carlos, what role do you see museums playing in the future when lived experience and content become art, when expressions of such experiences don't require a frame or official endorsement?
I think the role of museums already in the present needs to be reconsidered. I think museums should be places that play, especially museums that are independent museums, that are not necessarily contingent on governmental funds, for example. They should play because they are public spaces for gathering people, they should perhaps play the role of places to rethink ideas around monuments, for example, or memorials, or that don't necessarily need to subscribe to such rigid ideas of what it means to collect or create memory or construct history. They should be more active spaces of interaction, less gated, less guarded, right? More public. And I feel that oftentimes museums are, fail to do that, even though many museums have great community. Wait, I just forgot the name of that role in the museum. Community outreach programs, and events like what we're doing today, etc. But oftentimes, I think museums think too highly of themselves, and I think they need to democratize without losing their vision and their mandate, so to speak. Museums should also be sanctuary spaces for communities in need. Right? And some museums have done that in the context of undocumented migration in this country, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests. So I think we are starting to see museums be less stuffy and more self-reflective about the role they should play in the present.
I so very much agree. I think that we're just about at time, but I want to offer one more question to the audience, or to Rima, if you have one more question to end, and then I'll come back and thank everyone one more time.
If there are no audience questions, then I guess I really like that last question, like talking about the different settings in which your work is presented in. So I wanted to ask you, kind of in an age where media is so accessible, kind of how do you think that might shape your art, and if you think that makes your art as like a political tool in some shape or form, or like just the accessibility of film and sharing media across the network, like how that might shape your art, and especially kind of in the context of COVID and how the world is shifting to an online place. So how do you navigate that as an artist?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I feel like I maybe touched a little bit on this when I spoke about building a website back in 2005, because I felt that I really was in need of finding an independent space that was not mediated by a corporation, so to speak. And which is something I find really troubling about the present, right? It's like all our forms of communication through social media are still mediated by billion-dollar corporations, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. They own our content. They can decide to let you speak or not. Like they make all of these decisions. But at the same time, they're crucial, right? As tools for organizing and for communicating. So I feel like I see so many artists using those platforms to communicate and present their work. I mean, there were such important platforms during the worst days of the pandemic, right? To stay connected and to speak up. But I still think that one needs to stand kind of a little bit distant and critical of what it means for you to use a platform that is so embedded with forms of capitalism and extraction and those things. So it's a really confusing answer that I just told you, but maybe you can take something out of that. I'm sorry.
I love ending on a confusing answer. I think it's great food for thought. So thank you so much, Carlos, for your presentation tonight, for sticking with us through so many wonderful questions. Thank you, Rima, for your questions. And thank you to our wonderful audience members for tuning in, for asking great questions. And if you are in the area and you're able and you feel safe, I hope you'll come by the Cantor. We're now open and you can see the exhibition in person. And if you're not in the area, or if you don't feel comfortable, I hope you'll head to our website where we've got a 3D virtual tour, which is a fair approximation of the show. Nothing is as good as seeing it in person, but we just hope that you will come and engage with the show, because Carlos's work and so many of the other works in the exhibition are exciting and important. So we hope to see you around one way or another. And thank you all very much. Have a great night.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Rima, for your questions, and everyone else. Bye-bye.
Bye,
You
everyone.
all.